On the longest day of the year, June 22nd, 1941, the sun rose over a Europe that was holding its breath. Along a border stretching nearly 2,000 miles, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers waited in the tall summer grass. They were the masters of the continent. They had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months. But they were about to step across a line from which there was no return. They were about to march into the graveyard of the Grand Army of Napoleon. If you want to understand the moment when the Second World War was decided, not on the battlefield, but in the mind of a dictator, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because we are going back to the dawn of the apocalypse. The decision to invade the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was not a reaction to a threat. It was a culmination of Adolf Hitler's entire political existence. For years, the Nazi regime and the Soviet Union had been bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a cynical alliance of convenience that had allowed Germany to secure its eastern flank while it dismantled the West. Trains loaded with Soviet grain, oil, and rubber arrived in Germany every day, fueling the very war machine that would soon turn against them. Logically, strategically, and economically, the pact was a lifeline for Germany. It allowed them to fight a one-front war against Great Britain, a situation the German General Staff had prayed for since 1914. But logic had no place in the wolf's lair. To Hitler, the pact was a painful temporary measure. His ideology was built on 2 pillars: the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism and the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space, in the East. He looked at the vast steppes of Russia and saw the future breadbasket of the Germanic Empire. He believed that the Slavic people were subhuman, fit only for slave labor. This racial arrogance blinded him to the strategic reality. He wasn't looking at a map of a sovereign nation with a massive industrial base. He was looking at a colony waiting to be taken. The planning for Barbarossa began in secret in the summer of 1940. Even before the Battle of Britain had been decided, the German High Command, the Oak Age, began to draw up the plans. They were intoxicated by their own success in France. They believed the Wehrmacht was invincible. They calculated that the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. "We have only to kick in the door," Hitler famously told his generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." This phrase, the rotten structure, is the key to the decision. German intelligence had convinced itself that the Soviet regime was fragile, that the people hated Stalin and would rise up to greet the invaders, and that the Red Army had been decapitated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. They were half right. The purges had indeed removed many competent officers, and the Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland had been abysmal, but they missed the resilience of the system. They mistook the silence of the Soviet people for weakness, rather than the quiet before a storm of patriotic fury. The generals, men like Halder and Brauchitsch, had reservations about the logistics, but they suppressed them. They were complicit in the hubris. They drew arrows on maps that stretched into infinity. Army Group North would take Leningrad. Army Group Center would take Moscow. Army Group South would take the oil fields of the Caucasus and the wheat of Ukraine. It was a plan of breathtaking ambition, requiring the German army to advance over 1,000 miles into a country with few paved roads, different railway gauges, and a winter that could freeze mercury. The decision to invade was also driven by a ticking clock in Hitler's mind. He believed that the United States would eventually enter the war on the side of Britain. He felt he had to knock out the Soviet Union quickly to secure the resources of the East, specifically the oil, to fight the long war against the Anglo-American alliance. It was a gamble of all or nothing. If Barbarossa succeeded, Germany would be unassailable, a continental fortress stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. If it failed, Germany would be trapped in a war of attrition it could not win. As the artillery crews loaded their guns in the pre-dawn darkness of June 22nd, they were not just starting a new campaign. They were initiating a war of annihilation. The orders issued to the troops were criminal. The Commissar order demanded the execution of Soviet political officers. The jurisdiction of military courts was suspended for crimes against civilians. This was not going to be a gentleman's war. It was an existential struggle that would radicalize the Soviet population and ensure that there would be no surrender, only victory or death. The decision was made. The die was cast. And as the first shell screamed across the border, the countdown to the destruction of the Third Reich began. At 3:15 a.m., the largest invasion force in human history surged forward. 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft crossed the border. The initial results seemed to confirm Hitler's prophecy. The Red Army was caught completely off guard. Stalin, who had refused to believe the intelligence warnings from his own spies and the British, was paralyzed by shock. If you enjoy uncovering the tactical details of history's massive battles, hit that like button to support our channel's mission. The first weeks of Barbarossa were a masterclass in Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe caught the Soviet Air Force on the ground. Rows of Soviet planes were destroyed before they could even start their engines. In the first day alone, the Soviets lost over 1,200 aircraft. The German panzer divisions, led by commanders like Guderian and Hoff, punched through the disorganized Soviet lines and raced into the rear. They didn't stop to fight the frontline troops. They encircled them. Huge pockets of Soviet troops were trapped at Białystok and Minsk. It looked like a replay of the victory in France, but on a gigantic scale. At Minsk, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers surrendered. The German newsreels showed endless columns of dusty, dejected Russian prisoners marching west. To the German public, and indeed to the world, it looked like the war was already won. The road to Moscow seemed open. But beneath the surface of these spectacular victories, the friction of war was already wearing down the Wehrmacht. The sheer scale of the Soviet Union was eating the German army alive. In France, a division could advance 50 miles and be in a new province. In Russia, they could advance 50 miles and still be in the middle of the same forest. The dust was choking the engines of the tanks. The unpaved roads disintegrated under the tracks of the heavy vehicles. Crucially, the decision to invade had been delayed by 5 critical weeks. Originally scheduled for May, Barbarossa had been pushed back to June because Hitler felt compelled to intervene in the Balkans to bail out his Italian ally, Mussolini, in Greece and Yugoslavia. Historians debate the impact of this delay endlessly, but the fact remains, those were 5 weeks of dry summer weather that the Germans would never get back. They were 5 weeks that could have placed them at the gates of Moscow before the autumn rains turned the ground into a swamp. Even in victory, the Germans were suffering losses they couldn't replace. Unlike the campaign in the West, the Soviet soldiers who were surrounded often didn't surrender immediately. They fought to the death. They emerged from the forest to attack supply trucks. The rotting structure was fighting back with savage ferocity. General Franz Halder noted in his diary as early as July, "It is becoming ever clearer that we have underestimated the Russian colossus." The strategic direction of the invasion also began to waver. Hitler and his generals started to argue. The generals wanted to drive straight for Moscow, the nerve center of the Soviet communication and transport network. They believed that taking the capital would decapitate the regime. Hitler, however, was obsessed with resources. He wanted to divert forces north to Leningrad and south, to Ukraine, to secure the agricultural and industrial heartlands. This indecision led to a fatal compromise. The central thrust toward Moscow was paused in August. The panzers were diverted south to encircle Kiev. Tactically, it was a massive success. The Battle of Kiev resulted in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest encirclement in history. Hitler called it the greatest battle in the history of the world. But strategically, it was a disaster. It cost the Germans a month of precious time. While the Germans were winning battles, the Soviets were winning the mobilization war. The Germans had expected to face about 200 Soviet divisions. By August, they had already identified 360. The Soviet Union was trading space for time and bodies for bullets. They were moving their entire industrial base, thousands of factories, onto trains and shipping them east, beyond the Urals, out of range of German bombers. The initial success of Barbarossa was a mirage. It was a victory of tactical brilliance over strategic impossibility. The German army was advancing deeper and deeper into a trap of its own making, stretching its supply lines to the breaking point, while the calendar relentlessly ticked toward October. The decision to invade was not just about starting a war. It was about starting a race against time that Germany was already losing. As the summer dust turned to autumn mud, the German soldier discovered a terrifying reality. The enemy had better tanks. For months, German propaganda had described the Soviet military as primitive and ill-equipped. But on the road to Moscow, the Panzers ran into the T-34 and the KV-1. If you want to understand how technology shifts the tide of war, verify that you are subscribed to our channel. The appearance of the T-34 was a shock that rippled through the entire German High Command. Here was a tank with sloped armor that deflected German shells, wide tracks that allowed it to move over soft mud, and a powerful 76mm gun. German anti-tank shells simply bounced off it. For the first time, the master race found itself technologically inferior to the subhumans they had come to conquer. The only way to stop a T-34 was to bring up the heavy 88mm flak guns or get close enough to throw a grenade into the tracks. This technological surprise was symptomatic of a larger intelligence failure. The decision to invade had been based on a gross underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity. The Germans assumed the Soviets could not replace their losses, but the Soviets were churning out tanks in tractor factories that had been converted overnight. Then came the Rasputitsa, the time without roads. In October, the autumn rains began. In Western Europe, rain means wet roads. In Russia, rain means the disappearance of roads. The dirt tracks turned into rivers of sticky, deep mud. It sucked the boots off soldiers. It swallowed trucks up to their axles. The horses, upon which the German logistics relied heavily, the Wehrmacht was far less mechanized than myth suggests, died by the thousands from exhaustion. The Blitzkrieg, which relied on speed and maneuver, ground to a halt. The advance was measured in meters, not miles. Fuel trucks couldn't reach the tanks. Artillery shells couldn't reach the guns. The German offensive, Operation Typhoon, the final push for Moscow, was literally stuck in the mud. While the Germans struggled, Stalin remained in Moscow. He had considered fleeing, but decided to stay. This decision galvanized the defense. On November 7th, with the Germans just miles from the city, Stalin held a traditional military parade in Red Square. The soldiers marched past the Kremlin and went straight from the parade ground to the front line. It was a masterful stroke of psychological warfare. And then, the Soviet spy Richard Sork sent a message from Tokyo that changed the world. He confirmed that Japan had decided to strike south against the United States and Britain, not north against the Soviet Union. This intelligence allowed Stalin to pull his elite Siberian divisions from the Far East. These were fresh troops, well-equipped, trained for winter warfare, and dressed in warm quilted uniforms. They were moved by rail to the defense of Moscow. The Germans, exhausted, freezing, and depleted, were not facing the broken remnants of the units they had destroyed in the summer. They were facing a new army. The intelligence failure was complete. The decision to invade had been based on the idea that Russia was a colossus with feet of clay. Instead, the Germans found that when they smashed the clay, there was iron underneath. The German commanders, staring through their binoculars, could see the spires of the Kremlin. They were tantalizingly close. Some reconnaissance units even reached the suburbs of the city. But they were a spent force. They had no winter clothing because a high command had arrogantly assumed the war would be over before winter. They were fighting in summer uniforms in sub-zero temperatures. Weapon oil froze. Bread had to be cut with saws. The decision to launch the war without preparing for winter was an act of criminal negligence that condemned hundreds of thousands to frostbite and death. On December 5, 1941, the thermometer outside Moscow dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The German offensive froze in its tracks. The next day, December 6th, the Siberian Division struck. It was the first time in World War II that the Wehrmacht suffered a major strategic defeat on land. Before we witnessed the collapse of the German front, hit that like button to support our deep historical analysis. The Soviet counteroffensive caught the Germans completely unprepared. They were stretched out in a thin line, shivering in their foxholes, with no reserves behind them. The fresh Soviet troops, skiing across the snow and supported by T-34s painted white, smashed through the German lines. Panic, for the first time, began to spread in the ranks of the invincible army. Generals Guderian and Hoepner requested permission to retreat to shorter, defensible lines. They wanted to save their heavy equipment and their men. Hitler, from his warm headquarters in East Prussia, issued his famous halt order. He commanded the troops to stand fast, to not yield a single inch of ground, and to fight to the last man. Fanatical resistance was the new strategy. Historians debate this order. Some say it saved the German army from a rout similar to Napoleon's disaster. By forcing them to fight where they stood, Hitler prevented a chaotic disintegration. But the cost was horrific. The German army lost its mobility, its greatest asset. It was forced into a brutal war of attrition in conditions it was not equipped for. The flower of the German army, the veterans of Poland and France, died in the snows outside Moscow. While the battle raged, another event occurred that sealed Germany's fate. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, on December 11th, Hitler declared war on the United States. This decision, inextricably linked to the failure of Barbarossa, ensured that Germany would now face the industrial might of America while still entangled in the death grip of the Soviet Union. The logic of Barbarossa had been to knock out Russia before fighting the Anglo-Americans. Now, Germany was fighting everyone at once. The strategic nightmare was reality. The failure to take Moscow meant the war would not be short. It would be long, bloody, and decided by industrial production. The logistical collapse of the winter of 1941 to 1942 was total. The locomotives couldn't handle the cold. The water in their boilers froze. The Germans had to switch to a hedgehog defense, holding on to key towns and rail junctions while the Soviets swarmed around them. The Luftwaffe, the terror of the skies in the summer, was grounded by the weather and a lack of spare parts. The decision to invade had now morphed into a struggle for survival. The German army that emerged from that winter was not the same army that had entered it. It was hardened, yes, but it was brittle. It had lost its aura of invincibility. The officers knew, even if they didn't say it aloud, that the war could no longer be won. They had struck the bear, wounded it, but failed to kill it. And now the bear was awake, angry, and growing stronger every day. By the spring of 1942, the front line had stabilized, but the strategic dynamic had shifted forever. Germany had lost the initiative. They could no longer attack everywhere at once. They had to choose. This led to the fateful decision to focus on the south, towards Stalingrad and the oil of the Caucasus, in Operation Blue. But this was merely a symptom of the original disease, the decision to invade in the first place. Make sure you are subscribed to follow the path to the end. The failure of Barbarossa created a manpower crisis that Germany could never solve. In 1941, the Wehrmacht suffered over 1 million casualties. These were experienced soldiers, NCOs, and junior officers who could not be replaced. To fill the gaps, Germany began to rely more and more on its reluctant allies, Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians, to hold the flanks. This weakness would be exploited by the Soviets at Stalingrad. Furthermore, the invasion radicalized the nature of the war. The atrocities committed by the SS and the Wehrmacht in the rear areas, the Holocaust by bullets, the burning of villages, the starvation of prisoners of war, meant that the Soviet population had no choice but to fight. If the Germans had come as liberators from Stalinism, treating the population with dignity, history might have been different. But the ideology that drove the decision to invade also dictated the conduct of the war. You cannot separate Barbarossa from the racial war of extermination. The resistance behind the lines grew. Partisans blew up railways, ambushed convoys, and forced the Germans to divert combat troops to secure their rear. The rotten structure had become a meat grinder. Economically, the invasion failed to deliver the promised bounty. The Soviets practiced a scorched earth policy. They burned the crops, blew up the dams, and flooded the mines. The Germans captured land, but not the resources they desperately needed. They were expending more oil to fight the war than they were capturing from the Soviet territories. The colonial empire Hitler envisioned was actually a drain on the German economy. Strategically, the Wehrmacht was now fighting a three-front war. The front line against the Red Army, the partisan war in the rear, and the air/sea war against the Western Allies. The decision to invade the USSR without securing victory in the West first violated the most basic rule of German military strategy since Bismarck: avoid a two-front war. Hitler had arrogantly assumed he could break this rule. As 1942 turned into 1943, the inevitability of defeat became clear to those who looked at the numbers. The Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in tanks and aircraft. The United States was pouring Lend-Lease supplies into Russia, trucks, radios, spam, and boots. The German soldier was fighting against the combined economic might of the world, all because of a decision made on June 22, 1941. The road from the gates of Moscow led directly to the ruins of Berlin. It was a long, bloody road paved with the consequences of Operation Barbarossa. When the Red Army finally stormed the German capital in 1945, they were the avenging angels of the war Hitler had started 4 years earlier. As we conclude this analysis, verify that you are subscribed. You won't want to miss our breakdown of the final days in the bunker. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was the singular moment that made Germany's defeat inevitable. It wasn't Stalingrad, it wasn't D-Day, and it wasn't El Alamein. Those were defeats that accelerated the end, but the cause of the end was Barbarossa. From the moment the first tank crossed the border, Germany was committed to a war of attrition. It lacked the manpower, resources, and industrial capacity to win. The tragedy is that it was an unforced error. Germany was in a dominant position in 1940. It controlled the continent. It had a non-aggression pact with its only rival on the continent. By breaking that pact, Hitler united his enemies and opened a Pandora's box of violence that eventually consumed his own nation. The legacy of Barbarossa is etched into the demographics of Europe. 27 million Soviet citizens died. 4 million German soldiers died. The map of Europe was redrawn. The Eastern European nations were liberated by the Red Army only to fall under Soviet domination for half a century, a direct result of the vacuum created by the German invasion. Military historians often ask, what if Hitler had taken Moscow? What if they hadn't diverted to Kiev? The answer is likely the same. The war might have lasted longer, but the result would have been the same. The geography of Russia, the resilience of its people, and the industrial might of the Allies were insurmountable obstacles. You cannot conquer a continent-sized nation with a strategy built on racism and wishful thinking. The decision that made defeat inevitable serves as a timeless warning about hubris. It demonstrates the danger of believing your own propaganda. The German leadership believed they were invincible, so they stopped planning for failure. They believed their enemy was subhuman, so they underestimated their capacity to fight. In the end, the rotten structure did not fall. It was a German Wehrmacht that broke itself against the walls of the East. The graves of the German soldiers scattered from the Polish border to the Volga are the silent witnesses to the catastrophic cost of one man's decision to march into sunrise on June 22, 1941. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the strategy of World War II. If you want to understand the other side of the hill and how Stalin recovered from the shock of the invasion, click the video on your screen now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share history.